Hello, beautiful friends. I am Laurel Bleadon-Maffei with Illuminating Souls, welcoming you to this episode of Sleepy Bedtime Blessings, a podcast designed to help you deepen in your connection with your angels while you rest, relax, and fall asleep. I am an angelic practitioner, a spiritual teacher, and an encourager of souls. And you can find out more about my services and offerings at my website, illuminatingsouls.com. But for now, I'm here to help you rest and hopefully go to sleep. You know, several years ago, I started listening to sleep podcasts to help me sleep. I didn't even know they existed, but one day I was randomly scrolling through some of the top charts on iTunes and came across a podcast called Sleep With Me. And at first I thought it might be a titillating, kind of show because of the title. And when I read what it was about, I was so intrigued. At the time, its host, Andrew Ackerman, was producing 3 episodes a week. And he writes all of his own content. And he does different kinds of episodes. And now that I'm publishing 2 episodes a week, I have such profound admiration for what he set out to do. And I started listening to his podcast and fell in love with it. And he had, and still does, has a lot of content, and so each night I would pick one of his episodes to listen to. And then around the time of pandemic, I started searching for other podcasts and started discovering other sleep podcasts, such as Sleepy, Get Sleepy, Sleepy Time Tales, and others. And in these, the people were reading books in public domain. And somewhere around a few months ago, I was feeling kind of flat and asked the angels to bring me sparks of inspiration. It's one of my favorite ways to create. I totally encourage you to do that. All you have to do is say, angels. Hey, angels. That's how I talk to them. You don't have to go into some sacred prayer. You just say, hey, hey, universe, God, angels, could use some help here. Will you bring me sparks of inspiration? And here are some of the guidelines for me when I'm working with these sparks. First of all, they come with their own energy. I don't know about you, but do you have a lot of energy to do a lot right now? I don't. And so I'm always looking for the things that bring me energy. And so when I work with sparks of inspiration, I'm seeking those experiences that will energize me. They come with their own battery pack. And so the idea for this podcast had been orbiting about. For many years, I have had a love affair with social media. Facebook, 2012 to about, 2018 was my jam. I loved it, and it really helped me build my business, and it was an authentic conversation that I loved, and it wouldn't surprise me if one of the ways you found me was through social media. But lately, my desire to interact in that kind of public venue has radically diminished. I find that the more I'm feeling empathically about what's going on in the world, the more I want to metaphorically pull the blanket over my head. And the reason I'm laughing is because I literally pull a blanket over my head to record this podcast. So I am in my blanket fort right now. And one of the things that is so beautiful about a podcast like this is that I get to generate this stream of love for you. And if you like it, maybe you'll send me an email and tell me that you like it, but there's no requirement for interactivity, that you get to simply receive this in your own intimate space. Whether you listen on a speaker or you put earbuds in, you get to have your own experience of this podcast without having to wade through how other people feel about it. And that's kind of what had started happening on social media. So the angels kept bringing me back to the idea of this podcast. That's one of the things I really love about it. I get to be with you in the purity of this moment, and I get to send it out to you so you can receive it in the purity of the moment when you are listening to it. And it feels like such a blessing. And my hope is you can feel the purity and the beauty of this broadcast, because truly there is divine love flowing through for you right now. And I am so grateful that you have made space in your day or evening or wee hours of the morning and honored me with the opportunity to keep you company. And I just love, love, love getting to share the angels with you. Truly, the angels are such a source of upliftment in my life. And I'm honored to get to share them with you because you have angels. And they're team you. They love you and they're here for you. So this is the part where I invite you to take some nice deep breaths in and out and cozy on in. Snuggle up. Pull the blankets over your head if you want. It's one of my favorite ways to sleep. And get comfortable and tell your body that your body has permission to rest. Let everything just calm down. And I'm going to ask the angels to send some soothing vibrations of light to you. And I'm going to say a prayer that invites the angels here, although they're already here. So beautiful angels on high, with profound gratitude and love, I ask that you join us here. I ask that you imbue this broadcast with love and with magic and with comforting, soothing energies, so that each person who listens to this message will receive the waves of love that are perfect for where they are right now. Angels, we are so grateful for this opportunity to be together, to feel the light, and to bathe in the goodness. So, dear one, just take another breath in and out and allow yourself to feel or sense or simply imagine the waves of love that are streaming to you. You know, I know that it sometimes trips people up because they want so badly to feel the angels or to see them, to have tangible proof that they're here. And sometimes that comes in unexpected ways. If you're clairsentient, you might feel some tingles or some goosebumps. You may find some tears coming forward because that often happens when their love comes in. Or you might not feel anything at all. But one of the things you can do is ask your angels, "Hey angels, will you bring me some signs of magic? Bring me some signs that you're with me." And then just pay attention. It might show up as repetitive numbers on a license plate in front of you as you drive to work in the morning. Or the perfect song that you haven't heard in years is suddenly playing on the radio, and it's a message from the angels. The angels can be very creative in the way they send you signs. You know, I was once in Hawaii taking an angel class, and we went to a parking lot for a Subway to get a sandwich, and right there at the wheel of the rental car was the charm of an angel wing that looked like it had broken off a bracelet. And I thought of all the things that I could find right now. And I knew it was a sign. A sign is a sign because you know or feel or sense that it is. So ask your angels for a sign so that you feel like you have a deeper sense of faith or knowingness that they're here. And if it's okay with you, I'll ask the angels for that for you too. Listen, if you don't want any signs of magic from them, just say, "Guys, that's not for me." And they will pull back a little bit. But in the world the way it is, I love asking for signs of magic. And I love asking for sparks of inspiration. Because I don't know about you, but I need them. It's part of my self-care and part of my sustenance. And I hope it is for you too. So your sparks of inspiration might come to you over the coming days, and you're under no obligation to do anything about them. Just notice them, experience them. Same thing with the signs of magic. We're not talking about a rare commodity. We are talking about opening to the abundance of love and support that is here for you. So take a breath in and allow your body to let go. And you have permission to drift off. There is nothing right now on the earth plane that requires your attention. You have permission to have some sweet dreams and have restorative, replenishing sleep. Tomorrow will be another day, and I'm going to say a prayer that you have a brighter tomorrow. We can always use a brighter tomorrow, can't we? But for now, you've done enough. And your angels will watch over you, and they will say prayers on your behalf. And let's just breathe together and rest into the love of your angels. And now I'm going to tell you a story. So tonight's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to share with you some snippets from my life, and then I'm going to read to you. And it'll all make sense why I'm doing it this way. And if you're not awake through this part, that's okay too. I promise to never produce content you have to stay awake for. How's that for an agreement? So, what I'm going to read to you tonight are some excerpts by a book that Samuel Goldwyn wrote. And if that name is familiar, it's probably because you've heard of the movie company Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, now known as MGM. Samuel Goldwyn was a part of that partnership. And the connection that I have to him is that when I moved to Los Angeles to work in the entertainment industry, the first job I had there was for the Samuel Goldwyn Company. It was a film production and distribution company founded and run by his son, Samuel Goldwyn Jr. And so I have a real soft place in my heart for them because they made it possible for me to move to Los Angeles and live my dream. So the place I thought I would begin is how I came to work in the entertainment industry. So we're going to take the Wayback Machine. I was always a little girl who loved television. I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, and we had a black and white TV that was in the living room. And at the time, there were only 4 or 5 TV stations. And there was something magical about that box and the characters I would watch, the stories and the shows, and I loved it. And the other thing that I loved was that in all of the TV shows, when people lived in Los Angeles, they didn't have to do winter. I was fascinated that winter didn't seem to exist there. You know, as a kid, I would watch the Rose Bowl parade, and in Chicago, we would be in 20 layers of warm clothing, and it didn't seem that the people there were all that cold. So from a young age, I knew that my heart's desire was to work in television and live in Los Angeles. And I had no idea how that would happen. I mean, that's not a career path that is well worn for little girls from Skokie, Illinois. And for some reason, I just figured it would happen. I've kind of had that sense about my career. I understand now more why that has happened for me. But at the time, I didn't know. And I wound up going to school for television broadcast. I attended Columbia College in Chicago, which is an arts school. And I wound up manifesting a job at a television station in Chicago, which was very unusual to get a job like that right out of school. And my job was the broadcast materials clerk. And it was my job to make sure we had all of the TV shows in-house for broadcast. This was in the 80s. So now we don't think anything of just downloading something over the internet, but back then, programs would be on 16 millimeter film or 1-inch or 2-inch tape, and they had to be quality checked, and that was my role, was to coordinate all of that. And so I knew people at all the different studios. And one day, I got a call from my contact at Samuel Goldwyn. He said, "You want to move to Los Angeles, don't you?" And I said, "I do." And he said, "I just gave 2 weeks' notice. You should apply for my job." And I did. And this was before fax machines. So I quickly put a resume together and FedExed it to the company. Now here's the weird thing when we talk about divine intervention. There's zero reason why they had to interview someone from Chicago for that job. It was an entry-level job that could have easily been filled by somebody who already lived in Los Angeles. But for some reason, they wanted to interview me. And they even flew me out for the interview and put me up in a hotel. And whatever flight they were booking me on, coach was sold out. And they flew me out first class. None of this should have happened. But sometimes the hand of God steps in and moves us where we are supposed to be. So they hired me. And I moved from Chicago to Los Angeles and began working for the Samuel Goldwyn Company, helping to coordinate the delivery of all of the broadcast materials that went out to TV stations. So I was connected with television stations all over the country. And it was such a cool job. I was in the film department, even though I worked with television, and there were a bunch of people my age, and I made amazing friends, and it was so exciting because I was so enthralled with the entertainment industry. I remember going to my first premiere. It was for an art house film that Goldwyn was distributing, and Entertainment Tonight was there. And I remember coming home at 2 a.m. and calling my mom. "Mom, I'm sorry to wake you up, but Entertainment Tonight was at the premiere." And I was there too. I was so excited. And you know what else was amazing was a few years there while I was there, Samuel Goldwyn Jr. produced the Oscars. And so for several years running, we got to go to the rehearsals for the Oscars. And one of the rules, at least it used to be, was all the presenters had to show up at the rehearsals. So I was so excited back then because that was my dream and I got to live it. You know, nowadays, if I got to go to Oscar rehearsals, it would be cool, but it wouldn't necessarily be up on my top 10 list of heart's desires. But back then it was. It was my dream. So I'm so grateful for Samuel Goldwyn Sr. and Samuel Goldwyn Jr. because they played a part in giving me an opportunity to live one of my dreams. And I have been very blessed in that way, that I've gotten to live a lot of my dreams. And back then I didn't know about the angels, but I know they are in that mix somehow, because it really was a miracle that all of that unfolded the way it did for me at the time. So thank you, Samuel Goldwyn Sr. and Jr., for helping create a path for me to get to live out one of my dreams. And so tonight I'm going to read to you from a book that Samuel Goldwyn Sr. published about how he got started in the film business. And it was published in 1923. The book is called Samuel Goldwyn Behind the Scene. And I'm going to skip to chapter 8, which is entitled The Discovery of Charlie Chaplin. Some years ago, William Fox bought the story A Fool There Was. For its leading role, he engaged a very prominent actress. She disappointed him at the last moment, and it was while he was at his wit's end to know how to replace her that he happened to go one day into his casting department. There were several extras standing around in the hope of picking up a day's work, and among these Fox's eye fell upon a dark-eyed girl. He looked at her. He looked again. Finally, he said to his casting director, "I wish you'd have some tests made of that girl. It seems to me she's got possibilities." The tests were made. They were so satisfactory that the girl was cast for the leading role of A Fool There Was. In it, she scored such a triumph that Fox bought immediately more similar vehicles for her. The girl's name was Theda Bara, and A Fool There Was the first of the vamp stories which for some seemed to consume the motion picture industry. Among producer of a very different type, who had been waxing strong during these years of our development, was Max Sennett. Sennett, originally a chorus man earning $5 a day, had been associated with D.W. Griffith and the old Biograph Studios. From these he departed with only about $500 or $600, and he produced his first films without any studio at all. The cameraman overcame this fundamental lack of focusing on people's front lawns and on any other part of the landscape which looked appealing. When at last his financial returns justified it, Sennett established a studio near Los Angeles. Mac's specialty had always been comedies, and among his early stars was noted screen comedian of another day, Ford Sterling. At the time when the Lasky Company started, Sterling was getting a salary phenomenal for that period. Yet being a perfectly normal star, he kept wanting more, and it was in an hour when Sennett feared he would not be able to keep pace with these increasing demands that he cast about him for someone to take Sterling's place. In this period of vigilance, he chanced to go to Pantages in Los Angeles. Among the acts of this performance, which represented the Second Circuit, that employing the less costly talent of the organization, there lingered in his mind the work of one comedian. Months afterwards, when Sterling really seemed on the point of leaving, Sennett thought immediately of the little comedian in the Second Circuit. He did not know where he was. He could not even remember his name. But he wired to an Eastern representative, "Get in touch with fellow called Chapman or Chamberlain, something like that, playing the Second Circuit." The representative had a hard time locating the person thus vaguely defined. At last, however, in a little Pennsylvania town, the agent caught up with Charlie Chaplin. He was getting $50 a week for his work in vaudeville, and when Senate took him on at 125, he seemed stunned by his good fortune. And did he make good at once in motion pictures? Mac has told me that he did not. It was days and days, the latter relates, before Charlie put over anything real. He tried all sorts of makeup. One of them, I remember, was a fat man, and they were all about equally flat. The fact of it was that for some time I felt a little uneasy as to whether my find was a very fortunate one. It must be remembered at this point, however, that Chaplin encountered at the outset of his screen career an almost inflexible conception of humor. He himself has told me how he had to combat this prejudice in creating his very first picture. I was a tramp in that story, he recalls, and they wanted me to do all the usual slapstick stunts. I had to beg them to let me play the part my way. If you want somebody to pull all the old gags, I said to Senate, why did you hire me? You can get a man at $25 to do that sort of stuff. So at last they gave in to my idea. This I had worked out carefully. A tramp in a fine hotel. There's a universal situation for you. Hardly a human being that hasn't duplicated the feeling of being poor, alone, out of touch with the crowd about him, of trying to identify himself somehow with the fine alien throng. So I did the little touches here of imitation, the pulling down of shabby cuffs, the straightening of my hat, all the gestures that gave a wider meaning to the characterization. Chaplin's own account of his start is eloquent of the creative imagination which has made him the supreme exponent of screen art. This first picture was a success. Even so, there were those in the Senate studios who looked askance upon such an advanced method. They didn't really appreciate Charlie in those early days, Mabel Norman has often said to me. I remember numerous times when people in the studio came up and asked me confidentially, "Say, do you think he's so funny? In my mind, he just can't touch Ford Sterling." They were so used to slapstick that imaginative comedy couldn't penetrate. When Chaplin went out to California to make his first pictures, he found the pantomimist just quoted a star in the Senate organization. After having been a model for Gibson and other noted illustrators, Mabel had worked with Mary Pickford and Blanche Sweet in the Biograph studios. She was still here when Senate, meeting her on the street one day, said, "How about going to California at $100 a week? I've just got some backing from my company, and I'm going to settle out there for a short time." Mabel had been rendered incredulous by her salary at the Biograph. She was so skeptical of there being any such salary as $100 a week that Senate's backers, to whom he had referred her, thought she was hesitating because of the insufficiency of the recompense. They thereupon offered her $25 more. Not long ago, my friend Edgar Selwyn, the theatrical producer and playwright, said to me, "We hear so much about our successful stars as they are today, yet most of us are a great deal more curious to hear the details of their earlier years." With this in mind, I am devoting a short space to the Senate studio of a former time, for although these days did not come under my direct observation, they have been described to me so often by Mabel Norman and Chaplin and Senate himself that they seem almost like a portion of my own experience. Certainly, too, such flashbacks are necessary to complete participation in the stories of my own immediate contacts with these two stars. The older Senate studio, like the stable which first cradled the Lasky Company, presented a striking contrast to the modern film background with its meticulous divisions of labor. It attempts to introduce the efficiency methods of a business establishment. Everybody knew everybody else. All the performers talked over in the most intimate fashion the details of a day's work. The stars could and did do all such chores as cutting films. Instead of a honeycomb of dressing rooms, there was a communal space where all the men put on their makeup. As to Mabel's dressing room, this was a crude, boarded cubicle with the oil stove familiar to all the old-timers in California studios. Altogether an atmosphere informal and light-hearted as that which we imagine surrounding a group of strolling players in Elizabethan times. Everyone knows that the long rainy seasons which in California interrupt those months of brilliant, unflagging sunshine. During such times the rain would drip ceaselessly from the roof of Senate's projection room, and as actors shivering from the cold dampness used to gather together after the day's work around one cozy spot in the studio, the oil stove in Mabel's dressing room. Here, by the hour, Chaplin, a slender little fellow of 22 or 3, attired unvaryingly in a checked suit, used to sit and talk with Mabel about work, books, and life. They were great pals, these two, and whenever Charlie wanted a raise, he would go back to Mabel and say, "Come now, you ask Mac for me." Sometimes, according to those who worked with the pair, the friendship was invaded by a little feeling of rivalry, especially on Chaplin's part. This was hardly strange, for Mabel's talent as a comedian was undoubted, and to this gift she added not only her experience on the screen, but a very exceptional beauty. Of course, the sentiment was only fleeting, but every now and then something would bring it to the surface. One day, when Chaplin entered the studio, he found Mabel standing beside the camera. Running over to Sennett, he asked the producer what it all meant. "Oh, nothing," replied Mac. "Only I've asked Mabel to direct you today." Chaplin said nothing, but for an hour or so he was quite evidently ruffled. Before the end of the day, however, all irritation had vanished, and the boxing bout which he represented the favorite muscular outlet of the two young comedians. Charlie and Mabel, as will be remembered, appeared in many comedies together. One of their scenes, which the public was never permitted to share, involved a motorcycle. On being asked if he could ride this vehicle, Charlie had replied promptly that he could. "Now you're sure you know how, Charlie?" Sennett inquired of him again, as on the day the scene was to be taken he confronted the comedian with this modern mechanism. "Why, of course I do," maintained Charlie stoutly. "I used to cycle all about London." With no apparent trepidation he mounted the cycle. Mabel jumped on behind him. An instant afterward, those watching the performance saw the two riders whirling down a steep hill with a fury that made a nor'easter look cool and collected. "Talk about Jock Gilpin's ride," laughed Mabel today as she tells the story. "I knew from the moment we set out that Charlie hadn't the least idea in the world how to guide or stop that machine, and as the trees and hills whizzed by us, I closed my eyes. My only wonder was when and how badly. At last it happened. When I opened my eyes again, it was from a long unconscious state. I had been dashed into a ditch at the side of the road, and a little farther on they found the souvenirs of poor old Charlie. You see," she concludes, "he hadn't realized that there was any difference between a cycle and a motorcycle." Just a little farther on, I shall pick up the thread of Miss Norman's career, where it became interwoven with my own professional interests. In the meanwhile, closing these glimpses of the Sennett studio in its early days, I shall proceed to developments in the Lasky Company. It had long been apparent to me that a merger of the Lasky and the Famous Players organizations promised many benefits. It would put an end to the costly competition for stars and stories, and it would effect a corresponding reduction in other expenses. To all such arguments, however, Mr. Zucker turned a deaf ear, and it was not until 1916 that I succeeded in overcoming his reluctance. Then, under the name of Famous Players Lasky Company, these two enterprises, which only a few years before had launched out with a capital representing conjointly less than $100,000, were incorporated at $25 million. It was a radiant day for me when the vision of this gigantic unification, held so persistently for many months, finally took form. But as so often happens, the fulfillment of my most cherished dream proved to be a weapon turned against me. Mr. Zucker was the president of the new organization. I was chairman of the board of directors. I shall not enter here into the differences which sundered us, both men accustomed to domination. I shall merely relate that only a few months after the formation of the new company, I resigned my interests in the Famous Players Lasky organization. But before leaving this phase of my career, I want to pay my heartfelt tribute to the man whom I consider responsible for much of the success won by Lasky Films, Cecil B. DeMille. Although I have had occasion to mention several instances where his judgment was at fault, I have never once lost the sense of how disproportionate these rare flaws were to the sum of his achievement. As a matter of fact, DeMille is seldom wrong in his valuations of either performer or story. Again and again, his judgment proved superior to both Lasky's and mine. Then, too, he adds to the qualities which make him a big director, a gift for personal reasons, which I have seldom seen equaled. Farrar was only one of the many Lasky players who got along wonderfully with our chief director, the courteous, self-controlled, kindly DeMille, who indeed could dislike him. Certainly my own thought of him always reaches far beyond our mere professional association. To me, at a time when I most needed it, DeMille was a true friend, and the memory of his truth and loyalty illumines one of the bitterest chapters of my life. Well, I left my company, and I was then not quite 35 years of age. I was accustomed to a life where every working hour was inspired by the one thought, how can I make the Lasky Company more significant? You can imagine, therefore, the terrible blankness of those days following my resignation. Feverishly, I cast about me for a new outlet for my organizing energy, and in the autumn of 1916, I, together with my friends Archie and Edgar Selwyn, the theatrical producers, Margaret Mayo and Arthur Hopkins, the theatrical producer, founded the Goldwyn Motion Picture Company. The beginning of this second film venture of mine involved conditions very different from those which attended the start of the Lasky Company 3 years before. Then the story was supreme and the Lasky Company was successful without any real overshadowing personalities. True, the field presented some great celebrities such as Mary Pickford, but the emphasis was not placed upon the player to the degree which afterward swayed the producer. Constantly this emphasis became more irresistible, and by the time that I started the Goldwyn Company, it was the player, not the play, which was the thing. Every theater owner in the country wanted personalities. Stars were now made overnight. New names came out in electric light almost every evening. Obviously, therefore, the only guarantee for the success of a new motion picture organization was the assemblage of a list of big names. Hence, it was upon an array of planets that the Goldwyn Company concentrated its initial energy. The first star we engaged was Mabel Normand, the second, Mae March, the third, Madge Kennedy. Add to these such towering figures from other histrionic firmaments as Mary Garden, Jane Cowell, and Maxine Elliott, and you will see why our competitors were warranted in feeling a deep uneasiness, for the engagement of these people was attended by enormous publicity. Newspapers featured many of our stellar connections, and added to this, huge posters blazoned with the names of our trophies carried promise of greatness to every hamlet in America. The first thing that I did, in fact, was to scatter these posters broadcast. Perhaps at first I did not quite realize that in building up the Lasky name, I had been in reality creating a Frankenstein. Later, however, the full force of this figure was to occur to me, for at every turn I was met by the ruthless competition of the famous Players Lasky Company. This was particularly acute in the engagement of stars. Added to obstructions of bitter rivalry came a personal misfortune. While playing handball at the athletic club, one day I broke my ankle. This kept me away from our studio for 3 months, and as my associates were inexperienced in picture production, my absence meant a loss to the company of thousands of dollars. It was indeed a maddening situation for one attempt to launch a new business where the odds were already sufficiently against him. The first Goldwyn film was just being released when America announced her participation in the war. Heretofore, the conflict had spelled advantage rather than a disaster to the American producer, insomuch as our films had become the rage in all neutral countries. But with America's precipitation came a new set of conditions. These, oppressive enough to picture industries long established, almost succeeded in crushing our new venture. First on the list were transportation difficulties. We were now unable to procure space on ships to move our products. This handicap was accompanied by a shortage of fuel, conservation of light, and scarcity of labor. The second obstacle of this group became so acute that we were sometimes obliged to use 4 studios in order to complete a day's production. Obviously, therefore, only our chance of survival lay in removing our establishment from the Fort Lee studio where we had been operating to a California one. This we did in the summer of 1918. Somewhat less than 2 years after America's entrance into the war, our payroll was $90,000. How to meet it? Here was the question which tortured every waking hour. At last I felt it incumbent upon me, as the largest single stockholder in the company and as the individual in our group personally responsible for loans amounting to $800,000 or $900,000, to lay the whole situation frankly before my associates. With one accord, they advised me that the company should go into the hands of a receiver. I could not sleep that night when everything which I had been building for the past years threatened to go down with the morrow. Money, credit, my reputation as a producer. How was I going to save them? Spent by my vigil, I arrived in my office the next morning. Here, after a talk with Mr. Shea, the controller of our company, it seemed to me that the one reprieve of which I had thought during the night was really available. The reprieve was this. We had branches in 25 different cities. Each branch represented $2,000 or $3,000 of ready money. By removing the total amount from all of them, we should be enabled to meet 1 week's payroll. And how about the next week? Asked the controller. I shrugged my shoulders, but inside I was thinking fiercely that something had to happen. It did. The very next week the armistice was signed. From this moment the entire complexion of the picture situation changed. Shipments to Europe came about almost immediately. Other difficulties cleared away. It was not long before the DuPonts of Wilmington and other prominent financiers invested $7 million cash in the Goldwyn Company. With this new capitalization, all my financial struggles ended. Today, the organization which bears my name is one of the 3 largest companies in the world. One day, while the receivership was threatening, Mabel Normand came up to my desk and handed me a long envelope. "What is this?" I asked her. "My Liberty bonds," she answered. "There are only $50,000 worth of them, but if they will tide you over, you may have them." Those interested in the personality of Mabel Normand can receive no more illuminating introduction to her than the incident just sketched. There are 100 tales of this characteristic response to any human appeal clustering about the name of Mabel Normand. One which came directly under my observation relates to a poor girl with a dependent family. This girl was stricken with tuberculosis, and although Mabel did not know her, she became interested in her condition through a friend of hers. Immediately she went to see her, and when she left, she pressed something into the sick girl's hand. It was only after she had gone that the other realized what her caller had left. It was a check for $1,000. Nor does Mabel wait for the large demand upon her sympathy. Gifts from her come unprovoked like manna. She is likely to go out and buy a $100 beaded bag for a stenographer in the organization, and just as likely to invest a corresponding amount in remembering somebody who she has met once and happened to like. I used to find it very hard to get Mabel to a set when the set was early in the morning. Extras and other members of the cast would have been waiting there for hours. The director would be fuming. At last somebody would be sent to investigate the whereabouts of the missing luminary. More than likely, she would be found writing letters in her dressing room. "But I don't feel in the humor this morning," she would sometimes say to me pleadingly. "How can I go down there and act that way?" My associate, Mr. Abraham Lair, made frequent attempts to correct this habit of Mabel's. He found himself forever frustrated, indeed disarmed, by the charm of manner, the delightful playfulness which Mabel possesses so abundantly. Once I remember, when she was exceptionally tardy, Lair met her in the studio with his face fixed in lines of righteous indignation. She approached him with one hand behind her back and the other uplifted in a gesture of the gayest, most irresistible command. "Wait," she cried, "before you say anything." With that, she brought forward a new and very beautiful photograph of herself and presented it to him with a curtsy. On the photograph were written these lines: "Roses are red, violets are blue. When I am late, I think of you." She watched him while he read these words, and then, her big brown eyes dancing with merriment, she said coaxingly, "That's the reason I was late, you see. I was thinking up something nice to write on your photograph. I didn't want to say just yours sincerely or something stupid like that." I do not need to say that Lair's face softened perceptibly, or that he forgot all about the judicial rebuke which he had evidently planned. For the picture collection of stage and screen celebrities which he had mounted under the glass top of his office desk represents a hobby, and this contribution of Mabel still occupies an honored place in the gallery. I do not mean for a moment to convey the idea that Miss Normand is an isolated example of tardiness. Many screen favorites heave and sigh as slowly as a swan. This is particularly true of comedians. Chaplin, for example, often keeps his associates waiting for hours. Indeed, there are entire days when he is absolutely unable to work. The fact of it is, the efficiency engineer will never be able to control a picture studio. Such an expectation is as vain as the belief that you could obtain a poet's best work by snapping your fingers over him and crying, "Come, come, we want another sonnet and a gross of couplets before lunch." for the best screen acting is naturally inspirational. True, some performers are able to turn on their emotional faucets at any time. Mary Pickford, as I have related, rings up early every morning, but then she is a systematized human being who presents in temperament the opposite pole from Mabel Normand. The latter is a creature of impulse. She never calculates the moment ahead for fear that the moment itself might calculate something she liked better. When she works hard, but she can't do it in step with the hour hand. Mabel has a really fine talent and she knows picture production from every angle, but the screen does not absorb all of her amazing vitality. Eagerly she turns to people, books, gaiety, strange scenes. She does not want to miss one glint of this dome of many-colored glass. The differences of degree in the attitude of Mary Pickford pictures and that of Mabel Normand is indicated by their varying response to European travel. Chaplin once said to a friend of mine, "You know, I was in Paris with Mary and Doug, and often they seemed really lost without their pictures." Far from the state of mind so familiar in the American businessman temporarily implicated with a gondola or ruined temple is the eagerness with which Mabel Normand returned last autumn from her first trip abroad. Oh, how I enjoyed every minute of it, she told me. Pictures, music, all the funny outdoor cafes, all of the funny people. She has always been an inveterate reader. This, of course, is at present one of the fashionable claims of the screen star, and in some cases I am obliged to say that the claim rests on very flimsy foundations. Right here, indeed, I feel compelled to anticipate by telling a story illustrative of this point. One day Charlie Chaplin went with me to a Los Angeles hospital where a friend of mine was recuperating. Left alone in the corridor, he wandered into a little sitting room. It was filled with books representing the most advanced taste in fiction, poetry, and criticism. "Whose room is this?" asked Chaplin of the nurse hovering over the scene. Quite evidently she did not recognize him, for she replied without a vestige of embarrassment, "Oh, this belongs to Mrs. Mildred Harris Chaplin." Charlie's face underwent a number of changes. "Oh, indeed. And is she reading these books?" he finally inquired. "Oh, no," returned the nurse in a matter-of-fact tone. "The books she really reads are in a little closet in her bedroom." Mabel Normand, however, does not regard books merely for their furnishing value. She gets really into the action of literature. Many people who are generous with money and material possessions are not equally so when it comes to that of a more difficult gift of time and thought. No such limitation exists in Mabel's nature. The one thing which makes her beloved is that going out of herself to others, that real love of people irradiating her most casual contact. Once I remember she was eating lunch in the Goldwyn Studio restaurant. The apple pie struck her as being especially successful, and she asked to see the cook. A few moments later, an ample old Irish woman in a gingham apron, with her sleeves rolled up, appeared behind the counter. Visibly, she was overcome with awe at the summons from the brilliant young star. It did not take Mabel long to remove such oppressive sentiments. Only a moment, and she had literally vaulted over the counter and had grabbed the astounded old woman in her arms. "Bless your heart," we heard her cry. "It's the best apple pie I've had since I left home." And as she left the scene, she tucked one of her inveterate bills into the cook's hand. Isn't that a wonderful story? I'm going to leave us drifting off on that lovely image of apple pie and kindness. And with that, I bid you good night, so you have a blessed night's sleep. And know that you are loved and you are precious And your angels are going to bring you signs of magic in the days to come. And I am deeply grateful for you. Good night.